ancient Greece, around the period of 1000 BC, cremation was a new method for dealing with the deceased. And to do it, you needed fire. Lots and lots of fire that sometimes had to burn for days. Once the body was burned, the remains were wrapped in an expensive purple cloth that was then placed in a bronze vessel. These vessels sat on a tripod, and they were a lot bigger than how you'd picture a typical urn today.
You know, something like 3 feet maybe across. So these are very elite burials, and it suggests there's something special about getting cremated that is some sort of privilege.
Sarah Murray is an archaeologist and historian who researches the socioeconomic institutions of early Greece. She's interested in why these vessels came to hold the cremated remains of elites.
I find certain interesting clues in later Greek myths about tripod cauldrons, because they do appear in a number of kind of tropes in Greek myth. Probably the most famous example involves the Greek anti-heroine Medea, and she meets this Greek hero Jason of Jason and the Argonauts because he's been sent on this mission to get the golden fleece from the kingdom where Medea is a princess. She helps him get the golden fleece because she falls in love with him, and then she comes back with him to where his evil uncle sent him away in the first place. This old man, Pelias, he thought that Jason would definitely die trying to get the golden fleece, so he didn't really want him to come home. Medea, to get revenge upon him, tricks his daughters into thinking that she has the ability to transform elderly things into younger things. So she has this big metal tripod vessel, and she takes an old goat and cuts it up into pieces and puts it in the tripod to cook it, and contrives it so that the daughters believe that a baby goat jumps out of the tripod instead of so that she's transformed this old goat by cooking it. So the girls are very impressed, and they take their old man and they chop him up into little pieces and they throw him in the cauldron. And of course, because they don't have the magic, right, he's just dead. So to some extent, I think this cremation rite, which again early on is really reserved for only very elite burials, could have been seen as a process that, right, if conducted correctly, gave the dead a chance at another life.
This example Sarah's giving, it's one interpretation she's developing to describe profound changes in the ancient world, specifically during the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age. Sarah calls them fiery transformations that turn one material into another. And in her reading, these transformations were weighted with deep social and cultural meaning. I'm Melissa Gismondi, and this is a brand new season of Humanities at Large from the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto. Over the course of this season, we'll be exploring the theme of undergrounds and underworlds through the work of JHI researchers. In this episode, Sarah Murray takes us back to the undergrounds and underworlds of ancient Greece.
The soldiers dragged me from behind the curtain and made me emperor. I'd ever wanted it. I think it was a mistake.
That was a clip from the classic 1976 BBC series I, Claudius, based on the novel by the English writer Robert Graves. It's a fictionalization of the life of the Roman emperor, and it was one of Sarah's first forays into the ancient world. So I started our conversation by asking her what it was about the story that resonated.
It's a good question. I have to really think myself back into whatever 19-year-old me thought was compelling. I suppose part of what made me feel excited about that book was the way, I mean, I guess we would call it world building. So Graves does an amazing job of kind of taking the Roman Empire and really bringing it to life in a very vivid, but also like humane way, where these emperors that you might see in like marble busts in an art museum come to life as these very complicated and often sort of sinister, conniving, three-dimensional people. But it's also very funny. So yeah, it just made me want to know more about the ancient world, essentially.
And this was at a time, if I remember correctly, when you were sort of figuring out like what did you want to study in university, what were you going to do, basically.
That's a nice way of putting it. I would say that it was a time where I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do, or really even why I was in the university, or whether I wanted to stay. Yeah, so it kind of galvanized me out of a period of malaise and muddle into just feeling excited about something, and feeling excited about learning more about something. And that kind of jolted me back into, thinking about what one could do and the kind of potential that life can hold.
So you mentioned, how Graves is really good at making these characters sort of come to life. And I'm curious if that has sort of impacted your style as a historian, whether it's in terms of how you write about the past or teach about the past or think about the past. Like the fact that you're sort of one of your entry points was a novel. Has this impacted you in any way in terms of maybe being more attentive to characters or stories or something like that?
That's a really good question. The answer might be no, because I have gravitated for this period in the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Ages is way, way earlier than the Roman period that Graves is talking about, for which it's really hard to talk about individual characters or kind of flesh out people's lives in that kind of rich three-dimensional way, just because we don't have a lot of like textual evidence, and even the material evidence we have there's a lot of it, but it leaves one wanting for a kind of narrative structure or insights into individual characters. But I can say that in terms of teaching, I definitely try to inject as much kind of rich three-dimensionality into the way that I present the ancient world to students as I can. So this includes like making bespoke cartoons that kind of show what's going on instead of simply explaining it, or giving a textbook. There's a way in which I tend to try to sell the ancient world to students the way that I bought it, as a kind of fun place that's really human and where things are going on beyond just a kind of dry series of facts about the rise and fall of empires or whatever the textbooks are usually talking about. And probably the reason I ended up going into the Bronze Age, the late Bronze Age, is that the story of what happened at the end of the Bronze Age is very kind of dramatic and almost novelistic. That probably reflects the same desire to look at what could be kind of dry, dusty, ancient historical facts and see them actually as the remains of complicated, kaleidoscopically interesting human worlds, right? That we might think of as lost to us, but that we can actually kind of recover.
So you mentioned this sort of what happened in the late Bronze Age, that, that there was this collapse, some kind of collapse. And I know you're less interested in what caused it, but just to sort of help set the stage, what do you think might have happened? Like, what are some of the ideas of what happened at that time?
Okay, yeah. So the late Bronze Age collapse is, I'm obviously biased, but I think it is one of the most kind of enduring, mysterious events from the distant past that we can kind of reconstruct to some extent. The late Bronze Age, we're talking here like the later second millennium BC, in the Mediterranean. Over the course of that second millennium, various kind of complex bureaucratic states had come into being. Something happened around 1200 BC. Within a couple of decades, maybe up to 30 or 40 years, pretty much all of these states disappear. And in some places, we have kind of fiery destruction at some of the palatial centers. At some sites, it seems like it's more a story of abandonment. An obvious question is like, what the heck happened to all these major states almost at the same time? And there has been a lot, of course, as one would expect, a lot of discussion about why this happened. There are some texts from Egypt that refer to a group of people they call the Sea Peoples, who they identify as a kind of marauding band of nomadic people. The old idea of why the collapse happened was that these people kind of showed up, not unlike the way that the Goths and the Vandals kind of swept in and destroyed the Roman Empire, so that there were these nebulous migrant groups who were hostile and came through and kind of swept away these states. But more recently, people attribute actually the movement of those people to the same kind of general disruptions that led to the collapse of the state. So that one doesn't cause the other. They're both caused by a series of other crises, which include probably to some extent climate change. There was, for instance, a period of increased aridity in the Aegean, which could have damaged the Mycenaean state's ability to levy taxes on things like grain, or created a crisis of the people against the state. So I might be happy to give the Mycenaean king some of my grain if there's still enough for me to survive and feed my family. If the climate changes such that it becomes harder for me to feed my family, I'm going to be more hostile to the state. So there's some idea that there were like problems like that led to uprisings. Political mismanagement is something people talk about. Ultimately, we don't really know. It seems like, as with any period of the human past, there were a lot of complicated factors that kind of all came together and led to this kind of core-wide collapse of these states.
You've heard Sarah talk about the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, two terms that, along with the Stone Age, get used to describe periods in ancient history. In this telling, human evolution is linked to the material people used to make tools: stone, bronze, and then iron. But Sarah has never found these categorizations particularly convincing.
And this tradition comes out of a long development in archaeological scholarship, which started in the 18th century. There was a guy trying to organize a museum collection and had all these tools made out of stone, bronze, and iron, and decided that the best way to categorize them would be by material type. And that was just a matter of convenience, ultimately. Like, if you go back in the 18th century, we really didn't know much about the prehistoric past. Like, a lot of the methods we use now to understand how things, like when we find something in the earth, how do we date it, right? How do we know where it came from? That kind of science of archaeology has really only developed in the last couple hundred years. So I kind of have been very invested in arguing that these ages of metal names are silly, and that we don't think anymore that what kind of tool type you have could have completely changed society. It's a very kind of simple way of thinking about the human past. So a lot of my research over the past 2 to 5 years has been pushing against the old rickety 3-age system and trying to think about how we might free ourselves of the legacy of these super evolutionary narratives that think of humans as just kind of little puppets that respond to a kind of techno-economic system instead of more complicated actors that have their own agency and maybe are doing something more interesting.
Mm-hmm. And I guess also it's a very sort of Whiggish notion of history too, of first we had stones, then we had bronze, then we had iron, then that we're continually getting better and more sophisticated.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's been cool about being at the JHI is that so many of my colleagues are doing research that's so obviously relevant and interesting and kind of urgent. And it's not maybe so obvious why anyone should care what happened 3,000 years ago. But I mean, I think that kind of what you just said gets to the heart of why it's important, because of course, if we think of all of human history as some inevitable march towards the nation state or a series of stages on an evolutionary path to capitalism or something like this, then it really diminishes the ability we can be creative in thinking about what human society could look like or how humans can interact with each other and the world. And, I think the past shows us that that's not, there's so much more going on than these stages and this sort of inevitable cyclicality or this inevitable march towards what we have now. Demolishing as much of those boring, old, sort of master narratives about the past, it gives us our human history back.
When it comes to the changes that took place at the end of the Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, Sarah's research considers the importance of iron smelting as a new technology. To help set the scene, I asked her to paint a picture for me of what iron smelting would have looked like at the time.
Essentially, there would be a furnace made of clay, and the iron ore includes iron, but it also includes all these waste materials. So stuff that's bonded chemically to the ore, the iron metal in the ore that you don't actually want. Right? So you take your iron ore, you load it into your furnace, and then what happens is as the kind of oxygen or as the heat kind of makes the molecules in the ore, looser, as it were, the oxygen in the air and the carbon in the air will bind with these impurities and then separate the metal parts of the ore that you want from all the extra stuff. And then what you'd be left with is what's called the iron bloom, which is a chunk of stuff that's mostly iron ore, but that still would have a lot of impurities kind of mixed into it. So that's when you get this classic scene of the smith with the anvil. So you take the bloom, you put it on some hard surface, and then you have to hammer it. And the hammering will sort of cause the little pieces of leftover waste to kind of shear off the bloom. Then you heat it up again, you continue that process, and eventually you get a relatively pure ingot of iron metal. And then from that, again, you can heat it further, hammer it into different shapes, so like a blade or something like this. And eventually you'll get your iron artifact that you want.
It goes without saying that behind all that heating was fire. It played another important role in another important transformation taking place at the time.
In the late Bronze Age, your average tomb is what's called a chamber tomb. And this would be a relatively large, round chamber dug out of, say, the bedrock or the soil with a little fun road that led down into it we call it dromos. And you would bury bodies in these chamber tombs. It seems like they're probably family groups and they're interested in keeping these group of people together in the mortuary sphere. Right after the collapse at the very end of the late Bronze Age, we see an increasing shift to individual burial. So instead of putting people in these collective, probably family group chamber tombs, people are being buried in individual tombs. Usually these are kind of simple pits cut down into the ground. And then we also get the introduction of cremation burials, which basically we had pretty much 0 examples of prior to about 1200 BC when this palatial collapse occurs. So that's another change, is you start to get these actual pyre-based cremation burials. And by a pyre-based cremation, I mean you build a big wooden pyre, a funeral pyre, you put the body in the fire, you burn the body at a very high temperature so that's reduced essentially to just ash and some of the more robust bones. And then you put the contents of the pyre, which could include all kinds of stuff like artifacts, offerings, food and drink sometimes. And then you put that together with the human remains into some kind of urn. and then put that into these individual burials. So it's a pretty dramatic change in the way we're treating this fraught transition from life into death. So that's, again, something that is very interesting that hasn't been very well explained, but that suggests people are behaving differently in this period.
Well, and so to unpack that a little bit, you've called some of these changes, or you refer to them as fiery transformations. Tell me a little bit about what you mean by that in terms of like, what is the significance? What's behind some of these changes in terms of maybe how people are adjusting how they see death and life and the afterlife and all of that?
Yeah, so this is a tough question to answer with any kind of coherence, I guess, because that's what I'm working on this year, and I haven't quite figured out how it all comes together. And of course, that's the fun of archaeology, really, is that it's hard to have certain answers. And for this period, we don't have any textual records. So it's really a process of looking at the material remains of these people's lives and trying to interpret what they were actually thinking about or what they were doing, what was important to them. So I always tell my students, if they're uncomfortable with uncertainty, they shouldn't ever become an archaeologist because we almost never have certain answers. But so when I'm talking about fiery transformation, it's a term that I decided on because I was trying to, again, in the aftermath of rejecting the idea that it was the invention of iron tools that changed society in the Iron Age, I was trying to find some way to explain or make sense of the changes that we do see in the archaeological record around that time. And usually archaeologists tend to categorize things quite aggressively. So people who study mortuary archaeology study mortuary archaeology. The start of cremation burial has really been treated by people who are interested in burial practices. The study of iron technology has usually been studied by people who study industrial archaeology, right? So change in technology in the past, the change in sort of craft economies. And then there's this whole other phenomenon that happens around the same time, which is the beginning of ritual practices that involve tons and tons of burnt animal sacrifice, which we don't really have evidence of happening in the Bronze Age, right? But usually, again, like people who study ritual archaeology are like looking at the history of religion. So what I found interesting looking across all these categories of evidence is that coincident with the introduction of iron metallurgy, there just seems to be a new focus in all these different realms of practice that kind of bring in transformation by fire in ways that seem totally novel. So fiery transformation to me is any process that involves using heat to change matter from one state to another. So making a cow from a cow into a pile of like greasy black bones is a form of transformation, right? Changing a like lumpy pile of clods of iron ore into a glowing kind of metal mass is a kind of transformation. And again, like putting a human body onto a funeral pyre and turning it into, again, ash and bone. It's another form of, right, transformation by heat. So I have coined the term an age of fiery transformation to try to bring all these different things into one analytical viewpoint and try to think about whether they might all have something to do with each other. You know, what I've really been thinking about this year is whether it could have to do with this new technology of iron smelting or iron working, and whether kind of exposure to a new form of transformational fire could have led to new focusing of reflection on what it means to exist in one state of matter or move from one state to another, such as going from living to dying or even vice versa. So those are some of the connections I'm trying to work through now. But I've really been thinking in dialogue with things that seem very relevant today, like the way that new technologies can change the way we think. And there are a lot of historical studies along these lines too. So for example, the invention of mechanical clocks made people think very differently about time simply because you had access to a method for keeping time. And there's a guy called Otto Meyer who, I mean, he wrote a book in the 80s that I just, I find very compelling, that works through how clocks became this very potent metaphor for all kinds of things, like how states should work, how the universe was ordered. And these are the far-reaching effects of new technologies on like the human mind that I am thinking about how to reconstruct for this Iron Age transition.
Earlier, you heard about those bronze tripod vessels, how they might have symbolized the possibility of rebirth after death. But there's another way in which Sarah thinks people might have interpreted this new technology. Another fiery transformation, so to speak.
In many cross-cultural contexts, iron is thought of as quite analogical to birth. So the furnace being the womb, essentially, and then the bloom comes out of the furnace in a way that is not unlike a human fetus kind of coming out of a female at birth, but then only through all these ordeals and kind of sufferings does the iron go from this immature state of the bloom to like a piece of real iron. And this has a lot of, again, analogies to the kind of initiation ceremonies that people go through to progress through various stages of life. And then unlike, say, a bronze artifact, which can easily be melted down and then reconstituted if it's broken, an iron artifact, if it gets broken, is much harder to kind of fix. So the death of an iron artifact is final in a way that the death of a human being is relatively final. So there are a lot of cultural contexts in which iron is used to kind of think through life phases because of the way that its production and demise has echoes with the stages of a human life. So part of my idea is whether that could sort of try to begin to explain how and why people became so fascinated with fiery transformation as a kind of nexus for ritual practice across like a number of different realms.
And the shift from a collective to individual burial and then cremation, is that, I guess that also then suggests, I know you've talked about this, it's more about individual lives as opposed to maybe a family or a community.
Yeah. I mean, again, if you want to think about metallurgy as somehow metaphorical for how value accrues, say, to something or someone, if you're a bronze smith, the quality of the bronze you produce to some extent depends on your skill as a metallurgist. So you have to know which kind of things to put in the alloy to produce the kind of artifact you want to make. But ultimately, you're probably starting with a bronze ingot that's a certain quality of material. And then you can kind of melt that and cast that into different shapes. There's a clear connection between what you start with, the raw material, and its quality, and the quality of the goods that you can produce. With iron, it's all about the process, right? So you make a good iron sword by being a good smith who can like beat it in certain ways and if the metal undergoes all these hammerings and quenchings and kind of like difficult life stages, then only then can it kind of achieve this value as like a special artifact. So to me, there's a way in which one could imagine those as metaphors for a kind of world in which people have status because of their hereditary, right, relationships, right? So I'm made of the material that went into making me, and that's kind of what's important about who I am, as opposed to the material becomes valuable because of what it can endure, but kind of has this like rugged individualism valence to the whole process. So I wonder again that there could be some kind of iron ideology that is less about heritable status and more about like what have you as an individual achieved, as opposed to like who's your dad.
So you mentioned the clock and the shift in terms of the influence that technology had. And obviously today we have totally new technologies all the time that are changing so much of our lives. I'm curious how spending time thinking about the social impact of technology in the ancient world sort of shapes how you see things today.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost vice versa. Like I doubt I would have even thought about opening up a set of hypotheses about how iron might have been the thing that made all these people change their behavior. If I didn't live in a world where I've gone from a youth where we didn't have any computers and no internet to being surrounded by young people who live their whole lives mediated by this technology, that creates a sort of obvious set of priors, right? We know almost like intuitively now that new technologies could really change people's behavior and the way people think about life. I mean, when I was in college, Facebook had just been invented. And, before that time, like no one was talking about like social networking or like networking as like scholarly apparatus. And since then, there's been this explosion in people researching networks and networking and the idea of like network science. And why? Because, right, suddenly we were confronted with this new set of technologies that showed us like who's in our network and how networks kind of shape our lives and all this kind of thing. So I think there are ways in which it is a little bit humbling as a human, because you want to think that your ideas come from some well of intuition deep inside. But I think the way we think about very fundamental things, like what's life for, or why do we do things a certain way, right? They really redound to the technologies that surround us and the kind of way that those make available certain avenues of thought. Again, that makes it feel like a research project that does have some connections to modernity, because it can go in this long line of moments of the human past where, even if against our will, a new technology comes into existence that pushes us in different paths of thought.
And I'm curious about how you think about collapse too, because obviously your project is sort of understanding how people transition in the face of collapse. And we are, whether it's political, social, climactic, this is, I think most people will agree, it's a period of reckoning and big changes. How does being able to take that long view, how do you think about collapse today?
Well, I suppose the thing that seems salient about the late Bronze Age collapse and the kind of people that lived in the immediate aftermath of that collapse is that, it's only a collapse if you are in a certain register of society. Although, of course, living through a period where things are changing rapidly can be disorienting, and right, there's a sense of uncertainty there that's frightening. It's all about your point of view. So my sense of the Bronze Age collapse is that there are a bunch of elites who were like doing a bad job of managing affairs, and that like people were happy to see them go. And in a lot of regions, like you do see people thriving, even though the political situation has changed. And what you've done is sort of slough off this top layer of elites and their palaces with their fancy stuff. And if we're interested in periods of complex states and high inequality, where you can have all your like ostrich egg baubles and like feel really good about how much better you are than everyone else, then maybe it's bad to see that upper echelon of society eliminated. But if you think that the king is bad and that like living under his bureaucracy is onerous, so you don't want, and the taxes are making it hard for you to raise your family, then it's not necessarily true that the collapse has a negative connotation. But it could be as much that people didn't like the way that people in charge were running their affairs and did something about it. I think it's an interesting period and a dynamic one, and probably there are winners and losers. But I don't think that the losers were people that we would identify with the most, right? They're the kind of Elon Musks of the Bronze Age, as it were. And maybe we don't mind if Elon loses his fortune, or, people with the fancy yachts, maybe don't need them. And if that goes away, as an archaeologist, we might be, oh no, like there aren't any yachts anymore. People must have had it. It must have been a disaster, where in fact, we're kind of losing things we didn't need. So that's an optimistic way of looking at it. I think in a way things have changed so much that thinking about collapse back then doesn't necessarily help us understand what we should be doing now. But it does at least show us that like we're not the first people to have to deal with complex and scary and changing times. The biggest change again is like the technological world that we've constructed it changes so much faster and it's kind of harder to maybe adjust if things really go in a different direction. What you learn as from being a prehistorian is that millions and millions of people have lived on this planet before us, and probably many will come after. Each of our individual existences just doesn't matter very much, but being a human can be very interesting and quite fun. People make all these interesting things. There's so much incredible art and creativity and kind of optimism, like in the face of what we understand to be the essential futility of our own existences. It makes it a very fun thing to be a human alive in the world.
Sarah Murray is an associate professor in the Department of Classics at the University of Toronto. She was a 2024 to 2025 JHI Faculty Research Fellow. Earlier, you heard a clip from the 1976 BBC series I, Claudius, written by Jack Pullman and directed by Herbert Wise. Humanities at Large is produced by the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto. If you liked this conversation, be sure to share the episode with a friend or colleague, and don't forget to follow the show and leave us a 5-star review. It really helps to get the word out. I'm Melissa Gismondi, and I'll be back again in 2 weeks. Thanks for listening.